I graduated from the Royal Veterinary College in 2004, and I've worked on and off in primarily small animal practice ever since. So that's really my background. I did my master's, qualified or graduated in 2015, I think. So ethics and how we perceive ethical dilemmas has always been something I've been fascinated in, and it's something where I feel that there are increasing convergences between what we view as human ethical issues and what we see as animal ethical issues. The gap between them is getting smaller, and there's more and more crossover. And what we're going to talk tonight is really about the moral status of animals. So this isn't me telling you what they should be, but this is me telling you really what we come across in practice and what influences us when we have to make ethical and moral decisions about animals and what goes on behind that, really. So I will also apologise from the start. I'm not very good at doing these things without notes, so if you find me fiddling with lots of bits of paper, that's why. So I do apologise. I'll get better as I get more practice. So rats, cats and people are really very different entities. Rats and cats are animals, and people are, well, people. We are human. The difference between animal and human is really pretty easy to define. An animal is defined as any living organism which feeds on organic matter, typically having specialised sense organs and nervous systems and able to respond rapidly to stimuli. It's any such organism other than a human being. A human, on the other hand, is defined as any living or extinct member of the family Hominidae, characterised by superior intelligence, articulate speech, and erect carriage. These are biological definitions. They're useful. They help us to categorise animals and humans, but we can't really use them ethically because they're a bit too simplistic. And I think these pictures really demonstrate that. And I can put these pictures up because the children in these pictures are my children and my niece. And I think that no one would argue with me that they've got erect carriage, articulate speech, and superior intelligence, but they are characterised as human rather than animal. So these are biological definitions that we're working with. The definitions also make no mention of personhood, which is really crucial for how we see ourselves and how we make the distinction between us and animals. It fails to take into account the myriad of different ways in which we perceive and value animals and the effect that this has on the moral status and ethical status that we give to them. The moral status that we give to animals really depends on how we value them individually and collectively. How we value animals is determined by how we perceive them, by their worth to us as individuals and as a society, and by our relationship with them. Our relationship with animals has changed very dramatically over the past 300 years. They've evolved from being primarily tools that are there to do something for us to becoming companions, becoming part of our families and part of our lives. We're more aware of and more prepared to stand up for their rights and their welfare and their well-being. And in order to fully understand how we value them, we need to examine our attitudes towards animals. And our attitudes to animals have evolved really slowly over time. And 2,000 years ago, Aristotle said that since nature makes nothing with no purpose, without some end in sight, it must be that nature had made animals and plants for the sake of humans. The dominant view in the West, for the last 2,000 years really, has been that only those who are rational have special moral status. Animals have no reason, therefore, we have no responsibility or duty towards them. Descartes said that humans are unique in possessing sentience and rationality, whereas animals were merely complex machines without thought or feeling. An example of the prevailing attitudes at that time came from France in 1738, when Fontaine observed, "They administered beatings to dogs with perfect indifference and made fun of those who pitied the creatures as if they felt pain. They said the animals were clocks, that the little cries they emitted when struck were only the noise of a little spring that had been touched, but that the whole body was without feeling. They nailed poor creatures up on boards to vivisect them and see the circulation of the blood, which was a subject of great conversation. But it wasn't all bad. As far back as Sir Thomas Aquinas, we said that if animals are not worthy of moral consideration, we should still not be cruel to them, because if we're cruel to animals, this might lead towards cruelty to people. John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism, said that we should be kind to animals and treat them well because animals and humans shared a common father. And William Wilberforce, who abolished slavery, also founded the first Society of Prevention to Cruelty to Animals. So there were some good influences starting to come through, and we were starting to change how we perceived animals and what was appropriate behaviour towards them. Our attitudes towards animals, we know, are very heavily influenced by our cultural beliefs and by our religious beliefs. And these can range from really revering animals or revering certain animals, for example in Buddhism and Hinduism, all the way through to just viewing animals as a means to an end. They're just there to do a job for us, and that's it. Each animal will have its own value. Each animal has a value that may be economic, it may be practical, it may be emotional, or it may be a combination of the three. The value that they have to us as humans depends on what we use them for. We will use animals for food and for their body parts. We'll use them for work. We'll use them for medical research and scientific research. We use them for conservation and public health matters. We also use them for entertainment and companionship and company. The way that we value animals morally and ethically is therefore very variable, and it's very dependent on a number of different factors. It depends on the type of animal that we're talking about. It depends on what we do with them and what we use them for. It depends on our own personal ethical and moral frameworks. What I think is wrong might not be what you think is wrong. What you think is right might not be what I think is right. And it depends on the circumstances in which we're making these decisions. In terms of the ethical frameworks that we can use, there's a whole different variety, and I'm not going to go into them all because I think you could probably write a thesis on that. But they range from the very absolutist view, which is taken by the animal rights movement. And this really says that any action that fails to treat the animal as a being with inherent worth would violate that animal's right and is therefore morally wrong. Proponents of this view, such as Tom Regan, believe that treating an animal as a means to some human end is to violate that animal's rights. They say that all animals have an inherent worth, and accordingly they have the rights that protect such worth. All animals have these rights equally, and any practice that fails to respect the rights of these animals who have them is wrong, irrespective of human need, context, or culture. So that's one end of the animal rights spectrum. It goes all the way through to the utilitarian position, which is particularly supported by philosophers such as Peter Singer. And contemporary utilitarians argue that there is no morally justifiable way to exclude from moral consideration any non-humans or non-persons who can clearly suffer. They say that any being that has an interest in not suffering deserves to have that interest protected and taken into account, but the moral significance of that protection and that claim is situational, and it depends on the relative weight and the importance of the other morally significant claims. So they say that what matters most in the situation is therefore what the strength and the nature of these potentially competing interests and claims are, not whose they are. So animals do have rights, they do have moral considerations, but that's not necessarily the be-all and the end-all. It can be trumped by something else. But as anybody who's done any work with ethics at all will know, ethics is full of grey areas. It's very difficult practically to stick to one ethical framework all the time. We can have an ethical theory that we like, but when we actually have to make decisions, what we often have to use is a combination of ethical theories to come to an appropriate decision in the circumstances. And these combinations of theories that we use will vary because it will depend on the animal that we're discussing, It will depend on what we do with them and what we want from them. It will depend on how we view and value them, and it will depend on the circumstances in which we're making that decision. We're going to look at a few different types of animals to hopefully try and explain and illustrate this. The first type of animal that we're going to look at are production animals. Now, production animals we use all the time. Production animals are any animal which is farmed for human consumption, and it also includes those animals that are used for research. So it's very difficult, unless you are an incredibly committed vegan who researches a lot of the background where your products come from, to say that you have never used or you don't use a production animal in some way, shape or form. Okay, these animals are incredibly common and incredibly important to what we do as humans. But we give them a less significant moral status. And we do that primarily because they're there to provide us with a service. These are animals that have to do a job for us. We have less emotional and mental attachment to them, but we will often have a significant financial investment in them. And these animals must make a return on their investment. Economics, therefore, plays a large role in the decision-making about them for the producer, for the carer, but also for us as the consumer. There's been a lot of debate in the press over the last few months about the price of milk and how much would you be willing to pay for milk that comes from happy cows, and how much would you be willing to pay for the other things. So these decisions that we make about production animals do impact on the consumer, and what we do as consumers impacts on what happens to them. So we are involved in that situational ethical decision making there. Ethically, we take a very welfare-orientated approach to these types of animals. There are set and regulated welfare standards and regulations. They are subjected to public and press scrutiny if the producers fail to comply with them. And these animals really, we see that they're there for the good of us. So we have a welfare-orientated, utilitarian approach to these animals. They do a job for the good of us, not for the good of them. When we look at wildlife, the situation changes quite dramatically. And there tend to be two ways that we view wildlife. The first is when we're able to see the bigger picture. And the second, and sometimes more common, is when we have a very emotive knee-jerk response to what's happened. When we're able to look at the bigger picture when we're dealing with wildlife, we can quite happily accept and understand culling programs, we can accept controlled breeding programs, we can accept things that are designed perhaps to preserve species, maybe not ideal, but we can see that, we can see the bigger picture. And we find that easier if they deal with abstract numbers, or if it's a distant situation, it's not on our doorstep, we don't see it every day. But we find it difficult to accept it when it relates to individuals that we can really feel like we can identify with. This is a picture of Cecil the Lion, who was the lion that was shot in South Africa by the American dentist, who then went into hiding for a bit for his own protection. It caused a huge public outcry. Does anybody remember Marius the giraffe? Marius the giraffe was a young male giraffe who was in Copenhagen Zoo, who was culled because his genetics and his lineage meant that he couldn't be fitted into the international breeding program for giraffes. And there was no space for him at any other zoo because space is limited and they need to keep the gene pool fresh. And it caused a huge public outcry. Healthy young giraffe, born in a zoo, culled because he can't be used as part of the breeding program. Harambe the gorilla, anyone remember him? So Harambe the gorilla was the gorilla in Chicago, where the small child somehow managed to fall into the enclosure and Harambe was shot. Caused a big public outcry. Okay. So wildlife really appeals to our emotional sides, but it's often at the intense, extreme ends of emotion. We often feel that emotion without any responsibility. We get really outraged by it, but we're not actually going to do anything. We'll sit there and say how awful we think it is, but no one's going to go out there and start volunteering to, train up to become a wildlife ranger to protect lions like Marius. We might give a few pounds, we might do something like that, but it's emotion at the extreme, but it's without the responsibility. Substantial amounts of money go into wildlife projects, both abroad and at home, and they have an indirect financial impact on the environment and animals and people. In the UK, one of the best examples of this is the control measures that are put in place to control tuberculosis in cattle. So these involve the testing and the culling of cattle that are infected, but also the capture and vaccination and culling of badgers. It's a hugely expensive project. And this has a financial impact on the farmer of the cattle. It has a financial impact on the surrounding environment, the cost of produce for the consumer. The less beef and the less milk we have going onto the market, the more that we as the consumer will have to pay for them. And it has an impact, indirect impacts that we don't always think about. So the badger vaccination programme was actually suspended at one point because they used the same BCG vaccination that we use in people. And we were running out of it in people because we were using so much in badgers. So there are lots of different impacts and lots of different groups that have to be taken into account when we look at the moral and ethical considerations when we're making decisions about these animals. Ethically, we view wildlife with a combination of utilitarian, care and rights ethics, and we give them a higher moral status than production animals. We value animals for their companionship as well and their company, because we easily will form very strong emotive and psychological bonds with them. The human-animal bond is crucially important to this, and this is defined as a mutually beneficial and dynamic relationship which is influenced by behaviours which are essential to the health and well-being of both parties. These include, but are not limited to, emotional, psychological and physical interactions of people, animals and the environment. The human-animal bond is highly significant in how we view animals and the moral status that we give to them. Animals represent family, they represent company, security, a livelihood. Animals can represent a link to the past. And for some people, animals will give them a reason to live. The value of companion animals isn't linked to their monetary value or the investment that we make in them, and I can speak about this from a professional point of view. We have done some incredibly expensive things to rats and hamsters. You can buy one from Pets at Home for about £5. Okay, we will invest hundreds and hundreds sometimes thousands into these animals because of the bond that we have with them. It's much harder to measure the return that we get from them financially. We can't measure the return in pounds and pence. It's unquantifiable because of that human-animal bond. We're emotionally and psychologically invested in these animals. It's very, very difficult, therefore, to categorise them morally and ethically because of the way that we view them and the importance they have to us. This human-animal bond isn't unique to companion animals. It's actually present to a greater or lesser extent in all of our dealings with animals. And it can crop up in some quite unusual situations as well. So it's important to remember that it's not just companion animals and pets that we can be bonded to, and therefore that does have an impact when we're making the financial decisions about the production animals. We have that investment, we have that bond with them there as well. And these are all complex examples of how we as humans actually award a moral status to animals. But it's not quite that straightforward. We know that animals have an intrinsic value, and companion animals even more so. And any animal that we have that strong human-animal bond will have a strong or high intrinsic value. The intrinsic value is the value that the animal possesses in its own right, as an end to itself, as opposed to the instrumental value, which is the value that it has to other animals, including humans. This intrinsic value is independent of external factors, such as its purchase price or caregivers' feelings for it, and it's based on scientific evidence of animals' sentience, cognition, personality, and social behaviour. Companion animals are the subject of special partiality and are largely seen as family members. The idea that non-human animals have a significant moral status, and certainly one that's an intrinsic moral status, is comparatively modern. And again, it really started with some of the work that Peter Singer did and his publication of Animal Liberation in the 1970s, when he began to challenge speciesism, which is the idea that humans have a superiority that means that we can exploit animals. But philosophical attempts to actually decide which animals deserve moral consideration are quite tricky. They're subjective and there is human bias in how we look at these. because they involve human values in the way that we approach the subject, and they also involve human value judgments in how we apply it to particular cases and particular animals. It's very difficult to be truly objective when we look at it. So what happens is that we create a moral hierarchy of animals. And some philosophers argue that the key thing in this moral hierarchy is what we call sentience. Sentience is the capacity to feel, perceive, or experience subjectively. It's what makes organisms worthy of moral consideration, and that's what we tend to base it on. And we say that sentient beings who are self-aware have a greater moral consideration of status than sentient beings that are not self-aware, and they have a greater moral consideration than insentient organisms and rocks and stuff like that. If you're a rock, you're bottom of the pile, but if you've got self-awareness, then you can go straight to the top and get you £200 for passing go. Sentient beings that are self-aware. I'm sure all of you will recognise some of the examples of sentient beings that are self-aware. They value one experience more than another. They experience pleasure and pain. They have an interest in avoiding pain and an interest in pleasurable experiences. They're aware of their own existence and their context, and this awareness and preference to carry on living is what makes them worthy of the highest level of moral consideration. They prefer to continue to stay alive. They experience pleasure and pain. They prefer to experience pleasure, and it includes humans and higher animals, or it includes most humans and most higher animals. So they're top of the level. Below them are sentient beings that are not self-aware. These have no idea if they're continuing to exist. They don't think about themselves in any meaningful way, and therefore we give them a lower level of moral consideration. They feel pleasure and they feel pain, and they prefer to feel pleasure, and it's morally wrong to cause them pain. But the killing and replacing of individual animals within these groups is not considered morally significant because we don't feel that there is a significant difference between individuals within these groups. They deserve some moral consideration, but not as much as other animals. And these include things like sheep, cats, fish, rodents, all things like that. At the bottom of the pile, or nearly at the bottom, slightly above rocks, are insentient animals. Insentient animals can't feel and nothing can matter to them. That's what the philosophical argument is. They don't have subjective experiences, so they can't experience events as good or bad. The argument goes that they deserve no moral consideration because it doesn't make sense to talk about treating them well or to talk about treating them badly. And Peter Singer said that where a being is not capable of suffering or of enjoyment, there is nothing to be taken into account. This group includes insects, it includes simple animals, and plants. So we can use sentience as part of our hierarchical structure for ranking animals and ranking the level of moral consideration that we give them. And we can include humans in it as well, because humans are sentient, self-aware beings. So far so good. Looks pretty straightforward. Humans are sentient, self-aware animals, worthy of the highest moral consideration, and then we go down the rank until you get to the rock at the bottom, which is just having a really bad day, or would be if it could feel. But there are a couple of problems with this approach, and they mostly focus around sentience. So the first problem is that actually sentience isn't really quite as straightforward as it first seems. The second problem is that if we follow this approach to the letter, there are other animals which are sentient and self-aware, which should therefore be given the same moral status as humans, and there are humans who lack sentience and self-awareness, who therefore should be demoted in their moral standing. Now let's have a look at the problems with sentience first. I don't know how many of you have pets, but I use these slides quite a lot when I do these talks because I think they sum up quite nicely some of the things we think about animals. So I don't know if you can read the caption at the bottom of the cartoon, but it's two dogs walking along, chatting to each other, and one of them says to the other, "It's always sit, stay, heel, never think, innovate, be yourself." Okay? One of the first problems with sentience is how do we compare the relative interests of different animals within the same category? and different animals in different categories. Interests, needs and wants come in different varieties with different weights attached to them. How do we include the relative weights of different interests when we're faced with moral choices? So our basic interests that we all have are those concerned with survival. These are the things that we all need in order to stay alive. Our serious interests are the ones that have a major impact on our quality of life. So if I said to you, you can stay alive, and in order to stay alive, you can eat Brussels sprouts for the rest of your life, but you can't eat anything else. Well, that's going to satisfy your basic interest, because it's going to keep you alive. But unless you happen to be particularly keen on Brussels sprouts and never want to eat anything again, then you could argue that that's going to have a fairly major impact on your quality of life. So that's going to impact on your serious interests. Your trivial interests are those wants that it's nice to have satisfied, but really you can manage perfectly well even if they're not. How do we judge an issue when satisfying the trivial interest of a higher animal, so one that's further up our moral hierarchy, is going to frustrate the basic interest of a lesser animal? For example, if we want to protect the basic interest of a fish to survive, then a human's trivial wish to eat it must be frustrated. How can we understand the mental landscape of any other sentient being? How can I understand what goes on in your head? And how can you understand what goes on in mine? We can map it out using neurochemistry and neurophysiology. We can look at anatomy, we can look at structures, we can look at behaviour. But really, we're just making inferences. We still don't know exactly what it is that makes us tick. All we can do when it comes to animals is imagine what they're feeling based on behaviour, based on anatomy, based on things like that. And there is a real risk that when we do that, we become very anthropomorphic. How do we understand, or how do we tell if a sentient being has a preference to carry on living? Well, to be honest, we can't. And we know that there will be certain points when sentient beings don't have a preference to carry on living. So we don't know that all sentient beings want to carry on living. And when we look at animals, we can't tell the difference between an animal's attempt to avoid being killed painfully and an animal's attempt to avoid being injured. What looks to us like the same, or what gives us the same response, could be the animal just avoiding a painful stimuli with no concept of its death, or it could be the animal having a wish to stay alive and avoiding being killed. We can't tell that by looking. And how do we judge self-awareness? Self-awareness is a conscious knowledge of oneself. When we use self-awareness and the preference to stay alive as criteria for full moral status, this is highly problematic because these characteristics aren't displayed by all humans, but are displayed by some animals. So this therefore would mean that some human beings would display less moral consideration or deserve less moral consideration than others, and possibly less than some non-human animals. Now that doesn't tend to sit very well with most people. And generally we regard this as unacceptable and immoral. We don't like the idea that we might put some people below some animals and some animals above some people. We tend to overcome this by elevating people to persons, by giving people personhood and saying that that's what makes us different and worthy of full moral consideration over animals. And this is an example of speciesism. It's a perfectly coherent moral position to take. We can use it in conjunction with the moral hierarchy of animals, but we just need to remember when we do it that it is an example of speciesism. So it's all pretty straightforward so far. Everyone happy about where they all stand? You all know where you are in relation to the rock and the giraffe and the gorilla and Trevor and all these kind of things. Yeah. We've seen how our attitudes towards animals influence how we value them, and how we can create a moral hierarchy of animals which is based on sentience and self-awareness, and how we can therefore separate humans from the mix by introducing personhood. But what makes us a person? What is personhood? When we looked at the definition of animal versus human, we said it's a biological one. The definition of animal versus human versus person starts to become more ethical and philosophical. A person is a being that has certain capacities or attributes such as reason, morality, consciousness or self-consciousness. The notion of personhood identifies a category of morally considerable beings that can be superimposed on humanity. Personhood is what makes us different from animals and therefore worthy of greater moral consideration. Locke says that a person is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. Descartes says that a person is a compound of body and soul. A person is a player in a drama or a life. Conversely, what's regarded as a non-person is someone that's non-existent or unimportant, as having no rights. But we've already said that animals have an intrinsic value, and this intrinsic value confers with it some rights. So if animals have some rights, they can't be a non-person because they have rights. So we're starting to run into a couple of sticky points there. The distinction between human and animal and person is not biological, it's philosophical and ethical. But is it really as clear as we think? How different are we really from animals when we make these distinctions? So in order to be persons, we have to have reason and memory and consciousness and sentience. We have to communicate, which is usually verbal. But we know that this doesn't hold true for all humans. The three little ones in the middle. I can promise you at that point none of them had good verbal communication. Only one of them had erect carriage, and that was temporary and dubious. How do we say that everyone in those capacities can? Now we can say with babies and things, well, they'll develop it, they have the capacity to, and that's fine. But we know that there are some humans that will never have that capacity. We know that there are some people who have neurological injuries and conditions that will never have the capacity for self-awareness and for sentience. If we use that as a definition of personhood and what makes us morally superior to animals or worthy of moral consideration, how do we deal with those people? Sometimes we can say, well, they've had it in the past, so we can include them, but we know that some people from birth will never have had that capacity. So it's not quite as clear as we thought. We know that there are animals that can reason, animals that have memory and consciousness and sentience, and that can communicate verbally. There's a huge amount of work that's gone on in dolphin communication and things like that. We know that they have very complex communication patterns. We know they have erect carriage. We know that they have memory and sentience and reasoning. Does that make them persons? Does that give them personhood? Is my cat a person? My cat's not a human, but my cat can communicate, can think, can reason. My cat's sentient. My cat's company, companionship, and family. My cat's in a relationship of mutual dependence with me. My great aunt is family and is in a persistent vegetative state. When does a human stop being a person, and when does an animal become a person? Does it matter? If the distinction between animal and human and person is blurred, what does this mean for the moral status that each group has? If we can't use a biological distinction between these groups to award moral status, can we use a social distinction and differences between them? Is this what separates us from animals and gives us a higher moral status? We know that humans have complex family and social structure. We know that humans can express emotion. We can solve and start social problems and conflicts. We have sex for pleasure, and we use language, and we can think abstractedly. So we're ticking a lot of boxes there for things that we can do as humans. But none of those activities is uniquely human. Many animal species display complex family and social structures. Wolves, chimpanzees, and elephants maintain extended family units based on complex and long-lasting individual relationships within a group. All animals living in complex social situations have to solve social problems, often employing social hierarchies as well as family and friendship groups. All animals living in complex social situations have to be able to read emotions. Otherwise, you're not going to last very long when someone's in a bad mood. We know that recognition of emotion is particularly important to maintaining these structures, and we know that many animals will demonstrate really very complex and long-lasting grieving behaviour after the loss of a partner or offspring or a member of the group. Human behaviour and cognition shares very deep roots with the behaviour and cognition of other animals. So it's not really surprising that actually we can't use these differences to separate us and say that we are worthy of higher moral consideration because we demonstrate these things. Perhaps, as Tom Regan argues, what's important is for moral consideration isn't the differences between humans and animals, but the similarities. He argues that the subjects of a life want and prefer things, believe and feel things, recall and expect things. All of these dimensions of our life, including our pleasure and pain, our enjoyment and suffering, our satisfaction and frustration, our continued existence or our untimely death, all make a difference to the quality of our life as lived, as experienced by us as individuals. As the same is true of animals, they too must be viewed as the experiencing subject of a life with an inherent value of their own. Without a clear, unambiguous distinction, we can't rely on set, rigid, ethical theories and frameworks to help us award moral status to animals and to make ethical decisions about animals and people. We have to be able to adapt our thinking, and more importantly, we have to be aware that we need to do this. Descartes' claim that only humans have sentience and rationality has been disproved. We know that animals are not merely complex machines. We also know that not all humans possess sentience and rationality, and generally we no longer believe that we have no responsibility or duty of care to those who lack sentience or rationality, be they human or animal. The extent of the moral consideration that we award to different animals is multifactorial. And although animals do have an intrinsic value in their own right, it does tend to be something that we award to them. We decide how much value an animal has. We decide how much moral consideration it should be given, and we make the decisions about that. It's also very situational. The moral consideration that we give to one animal in one situation will be different to the moral consideration that we give to another. We need to adopt combinations of ethical theories to justify human practices towards animals. These practices may cause pain, discomfort, they may cause suffering and death. And we do this partly because it helps us to create that moral distinction between human and animal, even though, as we've seen, that distinction between human and animal and person is really something very ineffable. So this viewpoint probably won't satisfy the absolutist position that's demanded of the animal rights movement, but it does support the argument that although humans and animals are different, these differences do not provide a philosophical defence for denying animals moral consideration. Conditions which are based on cognitive capacities or relationships are really irrelevant when we come to talk about moral consideration, because as we've seen, different animals have different levels of it, and so do different people. We can't say, it's a bit like saying you have to score over a certain amount in the Mensa test in order to be worthy of anything. We know that not everyone's going to do that. That doesn't make you less worthy, just makes you score less highly on that test. It doesn't mean it would be okay to line you all up against the wall and shoot you all because you didn't get that score. Okay, we can't use those differences when we're looking at the moral status that we give people, the moral status that we give animals, and the reasoning behind it. Conditions that are based on these things are really irrelevant because they're not the needs that you need to meet in order to be able to be harmed, in order to be able to be benefited. So from a veterinary perspective, when we look at the moral status of animals, we really do have to take into account these multifactorial approaches. We have to look at the situation that the animal's in, we have to look at what we use them for, we have to look at all the interested parties that have a say or have an interest in in the decision that we're making. We recognise and acknowledge that for many owners, their animals are persons, their animals are family. And many owners will give their animals human status and the high moral status that goes with it. Their moral status influences how we make decisions about them. We will help our clients to make decisions about their animals, not based on utilitarianism or rights ethics or sentience or suffering or personality, but what we look at is what's fair and what's just for that patient. So we make decisions based on kindness and fairness and what's in the best interest of our patient and our client. And we don't look at the difference between different types of animals, and we definitely don't look at the difference between human and person, because we know that for a vast majority of our clients, they consider their animals to be human and to be persons and to be part of their family. The rats, cats and people really, when we look at the moral distinctions between them, perhaps aren't quite as different entities as we thought they were at the beginning. That's not to say we're not different, and that's not to say we shouldn't award them a different moral status, but we shouldn't award it on the basis that you're a cat, you're just a rat, and you're great because you're a human. And we need to be aware of why we're making those decisions and the factors that go into them. The differences between us get smaller and smaller the more we look into it. And it gets harder and harder to make that decision, to make that distinction and say, right, that's a quality you need to be a human, that's a quality you need to be a person. Because when you come down to it, a lot of those qualities will cross over and a lot of those categories are very blurred. And that's true of a lot of ethics. Where we do differ from animals, sentient or insentient, is that we as humans do have great power. And we need to use that power with responsibility. We award animals a moral status so that we can make decisions about them, usually to our benefit. We need to be aware of that, and we need to factor that into our decision making. We have a huge capacity for good, but we also have a huge capacity to do damage. And sometimes by elevating ourselves above animals, we increase our capacity to do damage over our capacity to do good. We are all sharing the resources. We all need to consider those factors when we make those decisions, and we need to think about how the complex situations that we make these decisions in influences what happens. So really what we do from a veterinary point of view is try and treat all with compassion and kindness and fairness and respect, regardless of whether you're a rat, a cat or a person. Thank you very much.